The gown was cut to fail. Eliza saw it the instant she knelt to pin the hem, a full inch taken from the waist seam on the left side only, so the bodice would twist the moment its wearer breathed. Not an accident. An accident did not repeat 3 times down the same seam. Caroline turned before the cheval glass, ivory silk tightening beneath pins. "You will finish it as marked." Eliza touched the altered seam without moving the needle from her fingers. "The seam is made to bind, madam. Miss Winslow will not be able to raise her arms to dance." Caroline's reflection smiled. How observant for a seamstress. Behind the folding screen, Harriet Winslow shrank further into the shadow of it, her face gone the color of the muslin curtains. Eliza set the needle down on the work table. "I won't cause her that humiliation, not for any wage." "Then explain to Mrs. Fenwick why you are dismissed without a character." Caroline's chin lifted. "See how far your scruples carry you next." "Miss Vane." The voice came from the doorway, quiet and final. Nathaniel Ashcombe, Duke of Rivington, stood with one hand still on the frame, having heard enough to need no summary. Caroline's chin lifted further into performance. Harriet went still behind the screen. Eliza rose, the pincushion still strapped to her wrist. He looked at the pincushion, then at her face. "You refused the alteration." Eliza removed one bent pin and set it beside the needle. "I did." His attention moved to the screen, to Harriet's silence. "Knowing it would cost you your position?" "A character reference is worth little to me, Your Grace, if the price of earning it is helping to humiliate another woman." He studied her a moment, then turned to Caroline, offered a bow correct to the exact degree required and no further, and left without another word. Caroline recovered first, smoothing the silk at her hip. "You will still finish the gown before supper, regardless of what His Grace overheard. He will forget this by morning. Men of his rank forget a great deal when it is convenient." Eliza said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not cost her more. Caroline swept out behind the screen to be unpinned by her own maid, and for a moment the fitting room held only Eliza and Harriet. "You should not have spoken," Harriet whispered, though her eyes said the opposite. "She will make certain you suffer for it." "Someone had to." "I could not. My mother's sister keeps me on Caroline's charity. If I cross her, I have nowhere else, no house, no income, not even a room above a workshop." Harriet's hands twisted together at her waist. "You have less to lose than I do, and still you risked it." Eliza understood. Harriet was no freer to resist Caroline than she was. Mrs. Fenwick found her within the hour, face drawn tight with the worry of a housekeeper who liked a girl and could not protect her. "Gather your things from the workroom," she said. "I cannot say what His Grace intends, only that you are wanted nowhere else until he has decided it." Eliza folded her sewing kit with hands that did not quite shake and prepared herself to be turned out before nightfall. She had been 3 years poor. Her father's gaming debts had cost her mother the house in Bath and every friend who once called on them. A modista who owed her mother a kindness from better days had sent her here with one instruction: say nothing of what you were. Without a character from this house, no respectable household in England would take her next. Instead of dismissal, Mrs. Fenwick came that evening with an odd carefulness in her face. His Grace wanted her in the long gallery, something about the late Duchess's court gown. The gallery ran the length of the west wing, portraits of Ashcombes watching from both walls. Nathaniel stood beside an open trunk, ivory and silver tissue spread across a draped table. Eliza approached but did not touch the silk until he gestured her closer. "Mrs. Fenwick says you restore embroidery no one else in the county can match." He indicated the damaged bodice. "It must be ready before the royal reception. 3 weeks." "I can do the work, Your Grace." She lifted the old tissue paper aside and studied the tarnished silver thread along the collar. "But not in secret. Not after this afternoon. You'll work here, in daylight, where Mrs. Fenwick may account for every hour." He held her eyes a moment. "Miss Vane's opinion will no longer decide who is employed in my house." Eliza turned the bodice toward the window and found what she had suspected, a section of embroidery near the waist, cruder than the rest, stitched over damage rather than properly repaired. "Someone has patched this before, and poorly. The thread doesn't match the original. Done in haste, to hide rather than to mend. Then mend it as instructed and hide it better. I would rather remove the patch and rebuild the pattern beneath it, though it will take longer." She glanced toward the late Duchess's portrait above the trunk. "A restorer must know when instructions, followed exactly, would destroy the very thing they were meant to preserve. I had assumed a seamstress simply does as she is told." "Then you have never employed one who cared whether the work outlived her wages." Eliza set the bodice down. He turned to the lower panel, where a dark curling stain spread across the ivory silk, wide as her palm. "That is to be removed." "How did it happen?" He was quiet a moment, looking at the mark rather than at her. "A house fire, the winter I was 9, a housemaid's lamp overturned in an attic room. My mother carried the girl down 3 flights herself, in that gown, because there was no time to change first." His jaw tightened. "My father's family has always found it an embarrassment." Eliza kept the blackened silk spread between her hands. "Then removing it isn't restoration. It's rewriting the gown to say something that isn't true." His hand moved toward the scorched silk, then stopped before touching it. He told her to proceed with the roses and left the mark for another day. Caroline was, by every account below stairs, an accomplished woman. She remembered names, understood rank, handled guests without a misstep. Her failing was not incompetence. Her consideration ended where usefulness did. Eliza thought of this 2 mornings later in the service courtyard while a merchant's boy unloaded crates of silver thread ordered for the gown's final panels. She unrolled the first spool against the old embroidery and shook her head before the merchant had finished counting his delivery note. "This is too bright. It will sit against the aged silver like a new coin among old ones." The merchant drew himself up. "That is the finest silver-wound silk in the county, miss. I'll not have my goods refused by a seamstress with an opinion." "Then have them refused by the gown itself." Eliza held the new spool directly against the old embroidery. "Yours has a cold cast the original does not have. It would show the repair to anyone who looked closely." The merchant appealed past her, demanding to speak with the Duke himself, as though her judgment could not possibly be final. Nathaniel crossed the courtyard, drawn by the raised voice, and looked at the 2 spools held together in Eliza's hands. "Show me." She held them up again. He studied the difference, then nodded. "She is correct. The restoration is under Miss Hartwell's authority. Bring her a better match." The merchant left with his crates and considerably less certainty than he'd arrived with. Eliza said quietly that she hadn't asked him to defend her before witnesses. "I did not defend you," Nathaniel said. "I stated a fact he was unwilling to accept from a woman." The charity fete filled the south lawn 3 days later. Trestle tables, ribboned baskets, village children weaving between the legs of gentry. Eliza knelt in the grass with a basket of mending, repairing a farmer's daughter's torn hem while the girls sniffled about the older children seeing it. "There." Eliza bit off the thread. "No one will ever know." The child ran back into the game. Eliza looked up to find Nathaniel crossing the lawn toward her, a glass of lemonade untouched in his hand, a knot of political guests left mid-conversation behind him. A second child arrived at his sleeve almost at once, a boy of 6 trailing a length of collar ribbon come loose, holding it up with the frank expectation that a duke must know how to fix things same as anyone. Nathaniel turned it over twice, plainly uncertain which end went where, and attempted a knot that came apart the moment he tested it. "Give it here, before the boy loses it entirely to your knots." Eliza held out her hand, and he passed the ribbon over with the faint embarrassment of a man unused to failing in public. She threaded it through the collar loop and tied it off in seconds. Not a skill dukes are generally taught. Evidently not. He watched the boy run off satisfied. Eliza looked toward the political guests he had abandoned. "You've left your circle." Nathaniel glanced down at the lemonade as though he'd forgotten holding it. "My circle was discussing the price of wool." "You haven't touched it, Your Grace, because every man on this lawn wants something from you and calls it conversation." Eliza threaded her needle again. "It is tiring, being useful to everyone and known by none of them." He turned the glass slowly, watching the children rather than her. "I had not thought a seamstress would understand that particular exhaustion. I did not always sew for wages." She kept her eyes on the hem in her lap. "My father kept a house in Bath once, a library, a music room no one could afford by the end. I have not spoken of it since I came here." "I had wondered," he said. "Your speech does not match the position." "I would rather you had not wondered aloud. Pity is a poor substitute for wages, and I have had enough offers of the first to prefer the second." She held out her hand for the spool of thread resting near his boot. He crouched and passed it to her, and for a moment both their hands closed around it before he let go and rose without comment. "You are watched everywhere else you go," Eliza said. "Here, you are only in the way of children." A considerable improvement. He watched a boy demand his opinion of a frog before running off with it. A magistrate called his name from across the lawn. Nathaniel excused himself with a short nod, but looked back once before he reached the men waiting for him, and Eliza found she had watched him the whole distance without meaning to. The house came alive 2 evenings before the reception. Chandeliers were lowered and candles replaced by the dozen. Carriages began arriving by early afternoon. Guests swept into the current of greetings that Caroline, at the center of the entrance hall in claret silk, managed without a single hesitation. Eliza crossed the same hall with the finished gown draped over both arms, moving along its working edges the way household staff always moved through a house on such nights, visible to everyone and addressed by no one. Nathaniel, receiving a baron and his wife with 2 more guests waiting behind them, caught sight of her above the moving crowd and lost the thread of his own greeting long enough that the baron had to repeat himself. He found her there an hour later. Once the worst of the arrivals had thinned, the gown laid flat under the last daylight, silver roses restored and glowing where tarnish had once dulled them. The scorch mark remained dark and plain on the lower left panel. Eliza stepped back so nothing stood between him and the gown. Nathaniel studied the mark a long moment. "You did not remove it." "I could make it flawless, Your Grace, or I could make it true. I found I could not do both." "My father wanted it gone before I was old enough to object." His hand moved toward the scorched silk, then stopped short of touching it. "I never once considered it might be the truest thing she ever wore. The choice is yours to make, not mine. Leave it visible." He looked at her rather than the gown. "Thank you." 50 guests sat beneath candlelight 2 nights later, the restored gown displayed on its stand. when Caroline rose, wineglass still in hand. "I wonder," she said, pitching her voice to Carrie, "whether anyone has asked why a common seamstress was given liberty to alter a duchess's gown as she pleased. I am told she left a stain visible rather than remove it. Spite or simple incompetence." Glasses stopped halfway to mouths down the table. Eliza, seated below the salt among senior household staff permitted to observe the display, felt every eye in the room find her at once. Nathaniel set down his own glass. "Miss Hartwell, explain to my guests what that mark is and why it remains." Eliza rose, aware of 50 gazes measuring the plainness of her gown against the silver silk on its stand. "The mark was made the night the late Duchess carried an injured servant from a burning house in that gown, because there was no time to change first. His Grace and I agreed it should remain. It is a record of what she did." A murmur moved down the table, reassessment rather than mockery. Caroline's composure slipped, and she reached further. "And the alteration to my own gown, weeks past, was that also your judgment? Or your spite?" The seam had been cut to bind at Miss Winslow's waist 3 times along the same line. Eliza did not look away. "I refused to finish work that would humiliate her before this house." "A servant's word against mine," Caroline said. Near the sideboard, Caroline's own lady's maid set down the wine bottle she'd been carrying, her hands unsteady around its neck. "I cut that seam, madam, on your instruction. I did not care to, but I did as I was told." Caroline's father went very still in his chair. 3 seats down, Harriet turned toward Eliza, something like disbelief breaking loose in her face. Nathaniel let the silence hold before he spoke, quiet enough that the table leaned in to hear it. "I believe this engagement no longer serves either of our families with the honesty it requires." He made no claim on Eliza. He placed his rank behind the truth. Caroline did not weep or protest further. She set down her glass, inclined her head with practiced composure, and asked her father, in a voice gone level, whether the carriage might be readied for morning. Her father rose more slowly, understanding without being told that 3 votes he'd meant to deliver in the Commons had left the room with his daughter's dignity. Caroline's family departed within 2 days. Word came quietly that her father's support for the Canal Bill would not survive the broken engagement, and Nathaniel spent long hours with his steward, searching for votes elsewhere. Before Caroline could dismiss her maid without a character, Mrs. Fenwick offered the girl a place in the Rivington household, backed by Nathaniel's written account of her honesty. Harriet received the address of a widow seeking a companion and chose to apply. Eliza's own work went on as it always had, mending, pressing, ordinary labor that did not pause for anyone's private reckoning. Nathaniel did not seek her out, and she did not expect him to. 4 days later, she found him waiting in the textile room, where restored garments hung on padded forms around the walls. He held a folded paper out to her, rather than laying it on a table between them. "A contract," he said, "restoration of the family collection under your own name, wages fixed and paid quarterly regardless of any household's private disputes, yours to leave whenever you choose." Eliza unfolded it and read the wage line twice. "This is double what Mrs. Fenwick pays her upper servants. It is what the work is worth." He kept his distance while she read. "There is no condition attached beyond the work itself." "Then I accept on those terms." She folded the contract and held it against her chest. "It may be some months before I no longer depend on this household for my situation entirely. I am aware." He did not step closer. "When that is settled, when nothing about accepting me could be mistaken for necessity, I should like to call on you, not as your employer." "That may be a long spring, Your Grace." "I begin to suspect it will," he said. though I do not mind the waiting." Each restored garment now carried a label bearing Miss E. Hartwell's name. Nathaniel sought her judgment publicly, but kept his promise and did not call. It was March before he did, and by then Eliza directed 2 assistants and had turned down, with some satisfaction, an offer from a London modiste who wanted her hired away. When Nathaniel came, it was to walk with her along the garden path behind the orangery, an ordinary Tuesday, no occasion attached to it at all. "You refused the London position," he said. "I did. Their wage was generous. Their terms were not." She glanced sideways. "You seem relieved." "I am attempting not to appear relieved, with mixed success." They argued mildly over whether a Tudor tapestry uncovered in the attics was worth restoring or better left a curiosity, neither conceding before they turned back toward the house without settling it. It was, Eliza thought, the first disagreement she had been permitted to win or lose entirely on the evidence, with no wage or character hanging over the outcome. "You have not once told me I am wrong, simply because you outrank me." Nathaniel stopped at the garden gate and turned to face her fully. "You refused cruelty when silence would have protected you. You taught me a scar left visible may be more honest than flawless silk. I want a life in which you remain free to tell me when I am wrong." He did not reach for her hand. "Will you marry me, Eliza, without surrendering your work?" "My wages continue. My authority over the collection continues. I choose which pieces to accept and refuse, exactly as I do now." She watched his face for any flicker of hesitation and found none. "All of it continues," he said. "I would have it no other way." Nathaniel held out his hand only after she had named every term. Eliza placed her hand in his, and only then did he draw her close enough to kiss her once beside the garden gate, brief and certain, before either of them thought to wonder who might be watching from the house. The wedding, when it came, was a small affair by the standards of a duke's household, family, close friends, Mrs. Fenwick weeping openly from the second pew. Eliza wore a gown of pale grey silk she had cut and stitched herself, plain at the shoulder, without a single borrowed stone. Near the chapel door, where every guest passed on the way in, the late Duchess's restored court gown stood displayed. Silver roses caught the morning light along the bodice, and beneath them the scorch mark remained dark and plain against the ivory silk.